The words in our languages are human inventions, and each language does things differently. English has some interesting quirks. A cow is an animal, but the meat is beef. A pig becomes pork, and a lamb becomes mutton. Chicken becomes chicken, and fish becomes fish. Although the origins of these quirks is fun, a study called etymology, there's not very much controversy surrounding these examples. But other words can be controversial, especially when they are applied to people or their beliefs, and especially when the word itself contains meaning that isn't accepted by everyone or contains derogatory meaning. Let's take a controversial example. In the battle over abortion, one side self-identifies as pro-life and the other as pro-choice. However, both of these terms are viewed as loaded by the other side. Closer to middle-of-the-road neutral terms are pro-abortion and anti-abortion. That's, of course, if we're specifically talking about abortion only. It's neutral, but it isn't the term that each side prefers for itself. On the other side of the coin, each group tends to use not-so-neutral terms to define the other side, too. On the one side, anti-choice, and on the other side, anti-life or pro-death. We're talking here about neutrality, not accuracy. Perhaps the non-neutral terms mentioned are accurate, but they aren't neutral. They define people in a way in which they wouldn't accept it. Stepping into the realm of theology, people do the same things here too. Commonly, people end up defined by others, not names they chose for themselves. For example, the term Christian itself is one that was given to followers of Jesus, not one that they picked for themselves. That's a common theme, terming someone based on a person who holds those beliefs. So you have Nestorians after Nestorius, Calvinists after Calvin, Arminians after Arminius, Lutherans after Luther, and so on. Sometimes people use other terms, like Methodist, which was originally a slur against followers of John Wesley's teaching, but one they embraced, and others have taken on the name Wesleyan too. Still, other times people have been able to pick their own name. Nazarenes, for example, who chose their name as followers of Jesus the Nazarene, or Pentecostals, who chose their name based on their practice of the same gifts of the Spirit exercised at Pentecost, or various groups who go by the names of Churches of Christ, Churches of God, or Apostolic. Sometimes a name can have a derogatory meaning, or even a meaning that a group views as inaccurate, but they're still content eventually to use it. For example, many happily use the name Anabaptist. Anabaptist means someone who re-baptizes, that is, baptizes again. This name was used on the Anabaptists because they rejected infant baptism, so a person who was baptized as an infant would be re-baptized as a professing believer. But the Anabaptists didn't and don't really view themselves as Anabaptists or re-baptizers. Anabaptists, in their own view, don't re-baptize anyone. They would say that infant baptism, so-called, isn't actually baptism. So they are baptizing people for the first time. People who had water poured on them as an infant, perhaps, but not people who had really been baptized. So despite Anabaptists not accepting the etymology or the meaning behind the name they're given, they have accepted the name. That's a bit of an introduction to the question of who a Protestant is, because as we'll see, this term too has meaning attached to it. But Protestant is a very large blanket term that is applied to people with very different histories and different beliefs. As a result, some people embrace the term Protestant wholeheartedly, others accept the term but don't accept the meaning behind it, and others, though they may be called Protestants by people on the outside, reject the term being applied to themselves. Before we break that down into who thinks what, let's discuss a few more things so that we can see why some people dislike being called Protestants. And I'm sorry that in this video I'm mostly ignoring Orthodoxy and several other traditions because it would be a bit too complex to mention them here. I'll make do in future videos where we'll talk about the Orthodox relation to Catholics and Protestants. Now, let's take the statement, Jesus started only one church. Catholics tend to state this a lot. I've had plenty of comments on my channel. When a Catholic says this, they're typically meaning that there is one church, and that is the Catholic Church. Unless your church is in communion with them, that is, within the apostolic succession and under the authority of the Pope, you're not part of Christ's church. Meanwhile, many Protestants are also fine with Jesus started one church. The idea is that Jesus started a universal and visible church that is based on right and true doctrine. Protestants often, but not all the time, would say that you don't need bishops to ordain bishops in succession to be part of the church that Jesus started. You just need to teach the same doctrine that Christ and his apostles taught. Catholics teach apostolic succession as Christ ordaining the apostles who ordained other men, and these ordained others, and this line of ordination, this sacrament of holy orders, is necessary for a legitimate church to be established. Protestants have a few views on this point. Some accept this idea and say that they are part of it. Anglicans, for example, normally accept the idea of an episcopate. Some Protestants say that apostolic succession is the ideal, but not absolutely necessary. One example is other denominations with bishops that may not necessarily claim that their line of bishops comes from an unbroken chain back to the apostles. Some Lutherans or Methodists with episcopal polity, for example, are like this. They practice bishops ordaining bishops, but if the line is broken, it's not invalid to start a new line. Some Protestants accept the term of apostolic succession, but define it as a succession of doctrine. People pass along right doctrine generation to generation. There's not a necessary succession of any ministerial office per se, but if you have right doctrine, you pass that along. And some Protestants would just say that apostolic succession isn't part of their theology. Anyone can start a church. Christ gave to everyone, not just to the apostles or clergy, the authority to start a church. If a church needs to be started and an individual believes themselves called of God to start a church and meets biblical qualification, they can start a church. The authority is directly from Christ with no episcopate needed. There are other positions too, but those are some of the main ones. So if we go back to Jesus started only one church, once again, Catholics normally say, that's us. The Catholic Church is the church Christ started. Protestants tend to say, that's all of us. Or in other words, everyone who has that right doctrine is part of that one universal invisible church. Some Protestants would include Catholics and Protestants as containing these true believers, while others actually reject the Catholic Church, saying that they have strayed too far from right doctrine. People who believe that they are part of the Church of Christ, often known by that name or sometimes by the name of the Stone Campbell Restoration Movement, reject the idea of denominations being part of the true Church of Christ. The Church of Christ is a universal body to which all believers belong, and only believers. So members of denominations may be part if they have believed and been baptized for the remission of sins, at least theoretically. However, in most cases, they would view most of those in other denominations as having not met that requirement. A large portion, but not all, independent fundamental Baptists, along with some other Baptists like the American Baptist Association, would say that the church Christ started was a church that taught the same theology as Baptist churches today, and true churches need to, at a minimum, have some of that theology. The range of beliefs here can be a form of succession called landmarkism, in which a Baptist church must be started by another Baptist church to be legitimate, and this chain is believed to go back to the time of Christ, to a similar belief called spiritual kinship, in which the true doctrine has been practiced at all times, and you need to have that core set of beliefs to be a part of it, even if there isn't necessarily an unbroken chain. But there is overlap in the groups, so there never was a time when there wasn't true churches. What these Baptists believe that it takes for a church to be a true church in the chain or in the kinship can vary, but a common set includes that they had to baptize believers and not infants, baptize by immersion, and not view baptism as necessary for salvation. Other Baptists don't necessarily believe either of these theories, but would still say that Baptists and those with similar beliefs have been around at all times since the time of Christ. Meanwhile, other Baptists are content to accept views of Baptist origins that have them beginning in the 1600s. Baptists with a landmark or kinship view often would reject most or all other Protestant churches, along with Catholics and others as having legitimate churches. At the same time, these groups don't make being part of a legitimate church a qualification for salvation, so they tend to believe that there are two groups of people: saved people who are part of scriptural churches and saved people who aren't part of any church at all. One subgroup of landmark Baptists, called Baptist Briders, says that in heaven there will be the bride at the marriage supper of the Lamb, made up of saved Baptists, and there will be other saved individuals who weren't in scriptural churches, the friends of the bridegroom. Other groups claim absolute exclusivity of their churches being part of the true church. People who say this always reject being called a denomination because in their own view they aren't one. They're the whole church. Many Oneness Pentecostals would say only those churches which use the formula of baptism in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ are true churches. Jehovah's Witnesses view all denominational churches as apostate. With that being mentioned, the vast majority of Protestant denominations do not claim exclusivity for their denomination being the one true church. They would claim to just be one part of the true church. This includes most Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Pentecostals, non-denominational churches, Lutherans, and so on. Now, let's tackle the word Catholic. If you've already jumped on me and left a comment because of how I've used the word so far, you can go back and stealthily edit it because I'm going to clarify that now. Up until this point, when I've talked about Catholics, I'm referring to what is sometimes called the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in the same way that we've already talked about loaded terms, these can be loaded too. Many Catholics don't like the term Roman Catholic Church, as it may be construed to mean that we're talking about just a subset of the Catholic Church, as if there was any other Catholic Church, when, according to them, there's just one, the Catholic Church. Or sometimes Roman Catholic is used as a stand-in for only Latin Rite Catholic churches, as opposed to other Eastern Catholic churches which are also in communion with the Pope and part of the accepted apostolic succession. That being said, many Catholics do even refer to themselves as Roman Catholic, including several dioceses. Most commonly, though, when self-identified, the preferred term is the Catholic Church. That's problematic because when we talk of Protestants who view themselves as part of the Church or part of the Universal Church, often they would say that this universal church is the Catholic Church. Not the Roman Catholic Church, but rather that church that Jesus started can be called the Catholic Church, and Protestants are part of it. A great example of this can be found in reading The Translators to the Reader, written by the translators of the Authorized or King James Version of the Bible, and that used to be contained in all published editions. The translators were all part of the Church of England, and their statement is rather harsh toward the Catholic Church, or as they call them, the Popish Romanists. One of their statements, criticizing the Catholics who attack them for making the translation, is as follows: "And whereas they urge for their second defense of their vilifying and abusing of the English Bibles, or some pieces thereof which they meet with, for that heretics, forsooth, were the authors of the translations, heretics they call us, by the same right that they call themselves Catholics, both being wrong, we marvel what divinity taught them so." At that point, all the 47 translators of the KJV, all Anglicans, were happy to have themselves attached to a document which denied the Catholic Church the claim of being Catholic. Meanwhile, these same Anglicans would accept the title of Catholic for themselves, as they would gladly, along with most Protestants today, affirm the words of the Apostles' Creed: "I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints," and so on. When Protestants say this, they do not mean that they believe that, as they would call it, the Roman Catholic Church is legitimate, but rather they say that they do believe in the Holy Catholic Church, that is, the Church Universal to which they themselves belong. For example, the creed is posted on the Christian Reformed Church in North America website with an asterisk there, letting us know that Catholic refers to the true Christian church of all times and all places. Let me also throw in that Catholics don't believe that only Catholics are going to heaven. They do believe in extra ecclesiam nullus salus, or outside the church there is no salvation, and they do believe that the church being referred to is only the Catholic Church, aka Roman Catholic, and not Protestant churches. However, the Catholic Church also teaches that if a person, through no fault of their own, doesn't know the gospel of Christ or his church, they may also achieve salvation. May also means may not, but there is a chance. As Tim Staples says on Catholic.com, one can have a salvific relationship with the church without knowing the truth that the church is the fullness of Christ on this earth. So to sum up a bit of what I've just said and add a bit more, so-called Roman Catholics would say they are the only Catholics and the only true church. Most Protestants say they are part of the true Catholic Church. Some Protestants deny that Roman Catholics are part of the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, there is a very small subset of Protestants who deny that there really is a Catholic or universal church at all. Okay, so let's talk about how people define Protestant. One definition is anything that isn't Catholic, still speaking of the so-called Roman Catholic Church. This line of thought would go that there's only one church, the Catholic Church, the original church. So if you have some other church, you left the Catholic Church, you protested, you're a Protestant. A second definition would be about the same, but it just excludes a few people, like Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Church of the East. Certainly, these three groups at least would not accept being called Protestant, probably because they, along with many Catholics, would view that word by this third definition, meaning any denomination or church that originated in the Protestant Reformation or from another Protestant church. This third definition on the surface works well. We know that Lutherans, for example, and Presbyterians fit that bill. But other groups that Catholics call Protestant reject that title. The Church of Christ, as we mentioned earlier, claims to have the heritage of the church that Christ started and would reject a view of themselves originating after the Reformation. Likewise, many Baptists, as we said, claim that Baptists have existed since the time of Christ. Some Anabaptist groups, too, would say the term doesn't apply to them. And there's some Anglicans who claim to be fully Catholic, having in their view valid apostolic succession, and so resist the Protestant label. And there's also other so-called independent Catholics who also claim apostolic succession, but aren't in communion with the Pope and whose claims are rejected by the Catholic Church. People may sometimes call them Protestant, but they vigorously deny it. Let's put things another way. If a denomination accepts the term Protestant, it normally means they accept it as meaning that they are part of the universal Catholic Church, a part that accepted the Protestant Reformation as opposed to the part that rejected it. If a denomination rejects the term, they probably do so because they view the term Protestant as meaning that a church popped up out of nowhere at the Reformation without any authority, and they claim proper authority either by a different line of succession or by a restoration of proper authority or churches. Surveys are showing that more than ever, when asked to identify themselves, younger people who aren't Catholic or Orthodox don't choose to use the name Protestant, but rather say just a Christian. Some of the reasons just mentioned explain that. To many today, the term Christian seems less loaded and perhaps more defensible than Protestant does. We haven't solved anything, but at least we've explained it. This video didn't really cover beliefs of Protestants as much as dealing with the terminology. In this video, I've tried to help with explaining the discussion over this terminology, not establishing what exactly the right definitions ought to be. If you want to see what Protestants believe, try watching the video Christianity 50 Denominations Compared. Subscribe for more informative videos on Christian denominations.